Hello, welcome to the Historian channel. Leave your like, subscribe to help the channel reach more friends. So let's go. The man known to history as Socrates, or Socrates in Greek, was born between 470 and 468 BC in the village of Alopa, a suburb of the Greek city-state of Athens, located just to the east of the city walls. Despite being one of the undisputed intellectual fathers of Western civilization and one of the most consequential philosophers in history, scholars actually know shockingly few biographical details about Socrates for certain. His father, Socrates, was described in some sources as a stonemason or sculptor, and his mother, Punerit, was said to have been a midwife. At first glance, these details seem to suggest that Socrates had a upper-class upbringing, which was probably not the case. As one of the most famous public educators in Athens during his time, Socrates almost certainly received an elite education as a young man. Furthermore, his close friends and colleagues were some of Athens' wealthiest, most prominent, and most influential citizens, something that seems particularly unlikely for the son of a low-status, upper-class family, or even at the dawn of Athenian democracy. This set of suppositions is just one example of how modern scholars have attempted to construct a biography of the historical Socrates. This task has proven difficult and endlessly frustrating for historians due to the relative lack of reliable sources. A major barrier to understanding Socrates is that he left behind no writers of his own. All we know of him is what other ancient scholars and chroniclers wrote about him. Some of these sources are considered more reliable than others, although virtually none of them can be considered conclusively authoritative by modern standards. For various reasons, a majority of historians tend to accept the biographical details about Socrates found in the dialogue written by Plato and Xenophon, as both were pupils and friends of Socrates himself. Memories of Socrates would have still been relatively fresh for the people of Athens when dialogues like Plato's Apology and Crito, or Xenophon's Memorabilia, were first published roughly 10 to 20 years after his death. It stands to reason that if the biographical accounts of Plato and Xenophon had diverged dramatically from what Athenians remembered of Socrates' conduct, teachings, or his trial and execution, rebuttals likely would have appeared in the literary and historical records of the time. The historical record suggests that Plato and Xenophon may more accurately represent the historical Socrates than other sources, most of which were written many decades or even centuries after Socrates' death by ancient scholars such as Aristotle, Diogenes Laertius, and Plutarch. Have you ever wondered what consciousness is and how it came into being? These questions are among the greatest unsolved mysteries of science. For centuries, scientists and philosophers have been mystified by the connection between mind and matter. In his groundbreaking new book, The Dawn of Mind, Dr. James Cook, an Oxford-trained neuroscientist and friend of this channel, offers a compelling and bold new solution to this mystery. The Dawn of Mind explores the history of the science and philosophy of consciousness and provides a captivating and detailed breakdown of how consciousness came into existence. This is what reviewers have to say about the book, a gripping exploration of consciousness that reads like a Dan Brown thriller. Essential reading for anyone seeking to understand the greatest enigma of our time. The Dawn of Mind is not just a book about consciousness. It is an experience, an insightful, clear-eyed short course on the mysteries of life and consciousness, including your role in existence. So, if you're interested in discovering the nature of your own mind, follow the link in the video description and pre-order The Dawn of Mind, How Matter Became Conscious and Alive by Dr. James Cook, coming on December 3rd, 2024. That being said, there is still reason to read the dialogue of Plato and Xenophon with a certain amount of skepticism regarding how accurately they may have depicted or quoted Socrates. Both writers would have been subject to bias because Socrates was their beloved teacher and mentee. And indeed, their reverence for Socrates within wisdom is readily apparent in these texts. However, it is also possible that these authors may have shaped the words and actions of Socrates for their own rhetorical or literary purposes. This is not to say that either Plato or Xenophon, or any other ancient writer, historian, or chronicler, might have done so with malicious or fraudulent intent. Some historians have noted that it was common in the literature of the ancient world to pay tribute to important people either by crediting them with heroic acts or admirable ideas, or even by writing something in their name. Some writers may have even put their own words into the mouths of more famous, respected, or beloved figures in order to lend credibility to their own theses and ideas, something that many scholars believe both Plato and Xenophon did in some of their dialogues about Socrates. With all these considerations in mind, attempting to reconstruct the pharisaical Socrates might seem, to some, like an ectasis in futility, since none of the extant sources can be considered reliable by modern standards. Yet, this has certainly not hindered historians from trying. Numerous writers and researchers throughout the last 2.5 millennia have continued, despite these challenges, to pursue a clearer picture of Socrates. Very little is known about his early life and adolescence, but historians have attempted to reconstruct a picture of it using the scant few details available in the Socratic canon, combined with our historical knowledge of the lives of boys and men in classical Athens. The village of Alopa, where Socrates was born, was home to roughly 3,000 people, a little more than a third of whom were Athenian citizens. Only pre-born Athenian men were eligible for citizenship. The rest of the population of the village would have been made up of slaves, women, children, and non-Athenian foreigners, none of whom were eligible for citizenship. The life experiences of Socrates that are known to us indicate that he was almost certainly an Athenian citizen. Yet he attained citizenship himself likely means that his father, Socrates, was also an Athenian citizen. However, as a skilled tradesman, Socrates probably did not come from a particularly affluent or aristocratic background. The relatively privileged youth that Socrates seems to have endowed, however, suggests that his father had achieved some financial success in his profession and attained some social standing in his community. Socrates counted highly influential and wealthy Athenians among his friends, such as Elmas, the son of the Athenian statesman Aristides the Just. If Socrates was indeed a stonemason art sculptor, he was probably not a lowly artisan or laborer, but perhaps the foreman of his own shop or quarry, the master-mason. Descriptions of Socrates' mother, Funerite, suggest that she was better born than Socrates, another factor that points us to the probable professional and social success of her husband. We know even less about her. We know even less about Funerite than we do about Socrates. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates referred to her as a Maya or midwife, but it is unclear if this was meant in a literal professional sense. Some scholars wonder if Socrates was speaking metaphorically, referring instead to a matronly or nurturing quality in his mother. Athenian married women, even those of high social standing, had numerous domestic duties, which suggests that such women might not have had much time to dedicate themselves to pursuing a profession. However, according to one study of a small sample of ancient inscriptions, the majority of professional midwives identified in classical Greece were pre-born women of respectable status, if not high social status. These women even published medical texts and lectured publicly in their area of expertise. So, it's possible that Funerite might have been a legitimately practicing midwife at one point or another in her life. There was no such thing as organized public education in Athens in Socrates' day. He would have learned to read and write at home with a tutor, most likely an enslaved non-Athenian Greek or another foreigner taken captive in war. Almost all Athenian families of middle or upper class status owned at least a few slaves, and some of these individuals were tasked with educating the family's children. Up until the age of 12, the children were taught primarily to read and write and perhaps also to do basic arithmetic. The male children of freeborn and affluent Athenians during the 5th century BC seemed to enjoy a good deal of freedom and stimulation. While they were expected to be silent and docile in adult company, boys often accompanied their fathers into public spaces and adult forums. Young Socrates likely attended theatrical productions, religious festivals, athletic contests, informal public debates, or even banquets at the homes of family friends with his father. Athenian culture placed a marked emphasis on physical health and leisure. Games, sports, and exercise were highly valued and encouraged for boys of all ages. Athenian boys learned to swim and wrestle, and they played games of chance with knucklebones, much like dice games. By the age of 12, boys of middle to high social status usually began attending lessons in gymnastics and music. Training at the gymnasia was emphasized as necessary not only for personal health but to build strength and fitness among young incoming male citizens, who would later be required to serve in the military. Music studies in classical Athens were far more comprehensive than they are today. Not only did the study of music involve learning to play instruments such as the lyre, the flute, or the orlos, a double-reed pipe, but it also included the study of dance and poetry. Under the tutelage of the famed music master Lempos, young Socrates learned to play the lyre, lessons which he resumed in middle age when the musician Konos began instructing him in newer, more innovative playing techniques. In his youth, Socrates would have been taught to sing, dance, mimics, and recite poetry by poets like Pindar, Sappho, Anacreon, and other lyric poets. As we can see, music studies encompassed not only music and dance but also literature, since much lyric poetry was set to music. Interestingly, music in classical Athens also offered a good deal of history study and religious education, in addition to instruction in the artistic disciplines of music and dance. This is because poets were not just poets, but often historians and documentarians of the legends of the gods. Music and dance were also instrumental in classical Greek religious rites. This period of musical and gymnastic education in Socrates' young life likely lasted for 2 to 4 years. It is also possible that Socrates might have begun apprenticing in his father's trade sometime during his teenage years or early 20s. Athenian law required fathers to declare a professional livelihood for sons by the time they came of age, and it was probably common for boys to pursue the same professions as the fathers. Socrates may have spent any number of months or years working as a mason or sculptor in his father's shop. However, even if he did, it may not have been something demanded of him but perhaps something he pursued merely to keep himself busy and fit until he came of age and qualified for military service, something that was required of every young Athenian male citizen in Socrates' day. In 454 BT, when Socrates was about 15 years old, the Athenian assembly voted to remove the treasury of the Delian League from the island of Delos to Athens supposedly moved the treasury to protect it from potential incursions by the Persians, whom the Greek member states of the Delian League had together defeated just a few decades earlier. While the immense war chest, filled with gold and silver, had been constituted for all the League's member states, who contributed to it annually for the mutual defense, the rulers of Athens, including Veracles and the assembly, evidently decided that it was more of a deduction than a requirement. This was the beginning of a series of developments that eventually led to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Pericles used the Delian treasury to benefit and beautify the city of Athens, which still bore the scars of the Persian invasion. He embarked on an ambitious building program, which included impressive public edifices and spaces. The crowning glory of this revitalization project was the Parthenon, the exquisite temple of white marble built atop the Acropolis, housing a magnificent ivory and gold statue of the goddess Athena. Within the temple sanctuary, no doubt, the masons, sculptors, and other stoneworkers in Athens, perhaps even Socrates' father, Socrates, received many commissions and benefited handsomely from Pericles' building program. The Delian League soon began to break down as its member states grew increasingly outraged that our annual tributes, intended for the defense of all, seemed to be enriching only the deity of Athens. Pericles soon launched military actions against these so-called rogue states that refused to continue paying tribute. Rather than remaining a confederacy of equals, Athens was beginning to conduct itself more and more like an imperialist power, and other Greek states, such as Sparta and Corinth, began to mobilize against Athens and her remaining allies. By the time Socrates came of age, Athens would need every available citizen soldier to face a series of armed conflicts that would continue intermittently for more than 30 years. In the meantime, Socrates was still completing his education. At some point in his mid to late teens, the philosopher Anaxagoras became a tutor and mentor to Socrates. Anaxagoras was a student of the natural philosopher Anaximander, who was one of the first thinkers to attribute the workings of the cosmos to natural rather than divine phenomena. After examining a pollen meteorite, Anaxagoras judged that the sun was a fiery rock rather than the god Alias, as the Greeks believed, and Anaxagoras posited that moonlight was merely reflected sunlight, which, as it turned out, was correct. He also sought to explain phenomena such as volcanoes, earthquakes, and rainbows as arising from natural processes rather than the divine wrath or benevolence of the gods. In his travel journal, a contemporary scholar, Ion of Chios, reported that in 451 BT, Socrates visited the island of Samos with his tutor Alas. It is likely that Alat wanted to introduce his young pupil to another of his own teachers, the fellow natural philosopher Melichus of Deimos. This trip represents one of the few instances in Socrates' life when he was said to have left his home city-state of Athens, and may have been comparable to a modern post-graduation tour. In Plato's Apology, Socrates speaks of the fascination he held in his youth for the study of the natural world, although he eventually came to view the emerging field of natural science as less useful and less relevant to society than other philosophical pursuits and concerns. Having mentors and teachers like Alat undoubtedly helped awaken and foster in Socrates an empirical bent of mind, which would prove crucial to the later development of his own philosophical framework. At the beginning of the Greek New Year, after Socrates reached the age of 18, he would have presented himself before the council of his demi, where he would have attained his citizenship and independence. He would have been eligible to claim any property or wealth held in trust for him, submit himself for election by lot to public office, for example, as a magistrate or justice of the peace, and attend and vote in the Athenian assembly. At this point in his life, an Athenian citizen was mostly free to do as he pleased, both professionally and personally. In Pericles' Athens, however, the growing need for a robust military force meant that most young men and citizens of Socrates' age were called up for military training. The fact that Socrates seems to have become a career soldier for much of his life also attests to his family's comparatively high status. The expense of outfitting a hoplite soldier for a military career would have been nearly unattainable for a bucca-class Athenian, who probably made no more than 1 drachma a day, if that. The entire panoply of weapons and armor for a hoplite warrior could cost several hundred drachmas to make unless one's father handed down his own armor and weapons to his son. New recruits in Athens began their military training with ties of duty around the Attica Peninsula, where they might patrol the outlying villages and the Athenian frontier while engaging in regular training exercises. This method of training allowed recruits to build knowledge while keeping them close to Rome and relatively safe. No sources report whether or not Socrates fought in the Battle of Chaeronea, which was the first major conflict of the Peloponnesian War. He would have been about 22 at the time, an age likely to be called up for service. In the literature of the Socratic canon, Socrates is only explicitly mentioned as fighting in 2 particular battles, the Battle of Potidaea and the Battle of Delium. However, these 2 battles are spaced out over more than a decade, so it might be reasonable to assume that Socrates spent a good portion of his life as a career soldier. Socrates was 38 years old when the career campaign of Potidaea began and 46 years old when the Battle of Delium occurred. Athenian troops were rarely required to serve for such a long period, especially at such an advanced age, which might suggest that Socrates served voluntarily in these campaigns. If he served voluntarily for such a long time, especially during middle age, it could also be reasonable to assume that he spent much of his younger life, in his 20s or early 30s, becoming an adept and seasoned soldier. The image of the warrior poet is probably not one that many novice students of Socrates would expect to encounter, considering his more famous reputation in history as the biped, shabby-dressed, witty, and good-humored intellectual. However, Socrates seems to have had an impressive martial reputation on the battlefield. Interestingly, the name Socrates translates to safe in strength. His tolerance for discomfort, pain, and extreme temperatures was remarked upon by his fellow troops and friends. He was said to have marched backward and uncomplaining through ice and snow, with little more than a light cloak to cover his armor and keep him warm. At the Battle of Potidaea in 432 BT, he performed the daring rescue of his young protege, Alcibiades, who had foolishly broken ranks and charged the battlefield in pursuit of the fleeing Corinthians, acted impetuously. When he charged forward, he did so alone, and the rest of his hoplite unit quickly closed the gap their comrade had left, as they had been trained to do. Not one of his unit followed him forward. Breaking ranks in this fashion was ill-advised and could land a soldier in hot water with his superiors. The shield of each soldier in the line helped guard the body of a man next to him and enhanced the strength of the line itself against attack. Breaking ranks put one's fellow troops in real and immediate danger. When Socrates saw his young friend fall before a renewed onslaught by the Corinthians, he made the decision to break ranks himself. He rushed across the battlefield through the chaos of men hacking each other to bits. Reaching Alcibiades, he sharply and deadly bogged a young man away, along with his armor and pawn weapons, off the battlefield to take it. Consistent with Socrates' reputation for issuing ambitions for glory, fame, or preferment, Plato recorded that Socrates insisted that Alcibiades, not he, should be decorated for bravery. One historian has posited that perhaps Socrates avoided the adulation because he had, in fact, put his own unit in danger to save his young friend's life. Like the image of the warrior, the image of the strong, daring, able, and well-built young Socrates contrasts sharply with the usual image of him as an old, bearded, and cut man with a receding hairline, as depicted in his portraits and busts. Contemporaries of the elder Socrates, even his friends, described him as famously ugly, a short, balding man with a paunchy middle, a broad snub nose, thick lips, and widely spaced eyes that appeared to bulge. However, in the first bloom of youth, as a career soldier, Socrates probably looked very different. Years of gymnastics and military training, if not lifting heavy stones in his father's workshop, would have given him a straight and well-built figure. His shortness would have appeared as stockiness and solid strength. He might even have been perceived as handsome, with his widely spaced eyes, broad nose, and full lips situated in a younger face, likely complemented by an excellent physique. One is tempted to imagine him as a more striking figure in his youth. One might imagine someone akin to a young Marlon Brando. However, although several biographers have thought to explore the figure of Socrates in love, we actually know very little about his personal or romantic life. This has not stopped historians from speculating and theorizing, of course. One recent biography suggests that, as a young man, Socrates might have fallen in love with the famed intellectual Aspasia, a philosopher in her own right and the de facto wife of Pericles. The textual evidence for this is rather thin, as it relies on the assumption that a female figure named Diotima, whom Socrates mentions in Plato's Symposium as his instructress in all matters of love, is in fact Aspasia. The author points out that Aspasia is the only other woman in Plato's Dialogi who appears as an instructor to any of her male contemporaries, including Socrates. In Plato's Menexenus, she is also depicted leading philosophical discussions about love. While some historians might consider this textual evidence a bit of a stretch, but circumstantial evidence is somewhat more interesting and possibly more compelling. Sometime in his mid-30s or early 40s, Socrates became a tutor and mentor to the young Alcibiades, the very same young man Socrates rescued from the battlefield in 432 BC. Alcibiades was actually the ward of Pericles, who had become his guardian upon the death of Alcibiades' father, Cleinias, years before. It is unclear whether Socrates took Alcibiades under his wing before or after the Battle of Potidaea, but Plato records that the two were tenmates and messmates throughout the campaign. Alcibiades was not only Pericles' ward, but also a relation of Aspasia by marriage. He was probably about the same age as Socrates. Aspasia arrived in Athens in the early to mid-450s, at which time her sister was married to the elder Alcibiades, the grandfather of the younger Alcibiades. Aspasia lived in Athens for 2 years before she settled down with Pericles, who was twice her age, and had a son with him, Pericles the younger. During her early years in Athens, Aspasia quickly developed a reputation for her impressive education, intelligence, aristocratic bearing, and beauty. Her banquets and symporia were attended by some of Athens' most prominent citizens and thinkers, including Socrates himself, if Plato is to be believed. With all this in mind, it becomes more difficult to believe that Socrates' connection to Aspasia was purely intellectual. Socrates did not run in the same social circles as Pericles and Aspasia. Pega, if they were friends or at least social contemporaries, why is Plato so sprig in his references to Aspasia? Why is Pericles, who at some point entrusted his ward and the son of his old friend to the court and mentorship of Socrates, mentioned only once in any Socratic writers as having known or interacted with the famous philosopher? A branch of Pericles' family, the Athenian Alcmaeonids, who even came from the same village as Socrates. Xanthippe, whom Socrates married in his elderly years, is believed by some scholars to have been Pericles' cousin. Considering all of these connections, one is tempted to view the virtual absence of both Pericles and Aspasia from Plato and Xenophon as deliberate. Perhaps it had more to do with the widespread unpopularity that Pericles suffered from later on, or the public hostility and resentment towards Aspasia, who was labeled a harlot by many Athenians due to her influence over Pericles. Perhaps neither Plato nor Xenophon wanted Socrates to be tainted by association with these unpopular figures. Then again, a love affair between Socrates and Aspasia in the early 20s, because she married Pericles, might help explain why there are so many apparent connections between the three, yet almost no recorded interactions between them in the Socratic canon. While this remains largely speculative, it is nonetheless quite interesting youth scholarship for all to consider. What is significantly more certain is that Socrates was married twice throughout his lifetime. His first wife was named Xanthippe, the daughter of his father's wealthy friend Lysimachus and the granddaughter of Aristides the Just. Socrates is said to have refused to accept a dowry from Xanthippe's father, which suggests his high status, as it likely indicates he did not need it. Very little is known about Xanthippe, but she was likely quite a few years younger than Socrates. Plato records that when Socrates died at the age of 70, he had 2 sons approaching manhood. This suggests that his eldest son was born when Socrates was in his late 40s or early 50s, implying that Xanthippe was probably at least a decade younger than her husband, if not younger. Socrates and Xanthippe had 2 sons, Lamprocles and Socraniscus. At some point during his 50s, Socrates took a young woman named Xanthippe into his household as his mistress. When his wife Myrto later died, Socrates married Xanthippe, and they had a son named Lamprocles, who was apparently still a child of indeterminate age when Socrates was executed in 399 BC. That said, the details of Socrates' marriages are unclear, and different accounts suggest that he was married exclusively to Xanthippe between his military ties of duty and months or even years on campaign. During this time, Socrates continued his study and development of philosophy in his beloved Athens. Socrates famously eschewed the pursuit of wealth and never accepted money from the students he taught. Some historians believe that Socrates inherited several rental properties from which he derived his income, and he would also have been paid a salary and pension for his military service, which complicates his reputation as the impoverished intellectual. Still, the image of Socrates with which we are most familiar is that of the shabby, bipeded, good-natured, and urbane sage Bertan. He would walk every day to the Athenian agora, or public square, to frequent the booksellers, converse with his friends, argue good-naturedly with acquaintances, or take the time to answer the questions of his pupils. He would not only have kept abreast of all developments in the city, but he would also have become known to all of Athens, ranging from political elites, priests, and shopkeepers to artists, artisans, laborers, and fellow citizens, both young and old. Socrates regularly attended philosophical symposia at the homes of his wealthy friends, some of which are documented in the writings of Plato and Xenophon. These gatherings were essentially the ancient Greek equivalent of the 18th century French literary salons, where aristocratic, educated, intellectually accomplished, and endowed members of the society met to engage in serious examination and discussion of a particular point of philosophical inquiry, as well as to dine and drink together. Throughout his career as a public intellectual, known to all citizens of Athens and willing to engage in dialogue with everyone, Socrates developed a body of beliefs and a method of inquiry that became part of the very bedrock of modern Western civilization. By the time he reached adulthood, Socrates was disillusioned by the natural philosophy that had fascinated him as a younger man. The fields of physics and natural science were still in the incante at the time, and the questions that could be answered seemed to hold little practical or social utility. What, he wondered, was the point of understanding the inner workings of the natural world if they could not answer the universal why of human existence? Instead, he turned his mind toward epistemology and moral philosophy, two areas of inquiry that he believed were far more consequential to human improvement, happiness, and social cohesion. Epistemology is the study of the nature and origin of knowledge, and Socrates is considered one of its principal pioneers. What is knowledge? Socrates wondered. How is it gained? How do we know that the knowledge we possess is true? For Socrates, knowledge and an understanding of it were essential for the attainment of virtue, which, in turn, he believed was necessary for individual human happiness and broader social harmony. Ultimately, the acquisition of knowledge and virtues such as justice, wisdom, courage, piety, and temperate living would produce individuals who behaved according to what was right and avoided doing what was wrong. People who lived their lives in a morally incorrect way were, according to Socrates, invariably wretched and miserable, while those who lived by moral and ethical standards were invariably happy. For Socrates, the continued search for self-knowledge was paramount. The unexamined life, he famously believed, is not worth living. Alongside self-knowledge, Socrates believed that moral improvement and the cultivation of the soul are equally important goals for individuals and their communities. In addition to the fields of epistemology and ethics, Socrates also pioneered techniques known to philosophers as relentless, the dialectic, and what teachers now call the Socratic Method. The relentless is a process of cross-examination designed to expose the inaccuracy of another's belief or hypothesis, while the dialectic is a more collaborative question-and-answer exchange intended to encourage reasoned conclusions or knowledge to emerge. The dialectic approach is akin to what Socrates pursued during symposia and what teachers who embrace the Socratic method do in the classrooms today, using a guided question-and-answer approach to help the class reach conclusions as a group. According to Socrates himself, it may have been the use of his relentless technique that caused significant dislike of him to grow. Among his fellow Athenians, few people find it easy to like those who seem determined to show them that they aren't as smart as they think they are. While defending himself at his trial in Plato's Apology, Socrates narrated a series of events that, when they occurred, could not have failed to spark public resentment against him, likely perceived as self-aggrandizement. This episode is also described in Xenophon's Memorabilia, albeit with slight embellishments. So the story goes, a friend of Socrates and fellow philosopher, named Xenophon, visited the oracle at Delphi and asked her, "Who is wiser than Socrates?" To the surprise and perplexity of both men, the oracle replied, "No one is wiser than Socrates." This response utterly perplexed Socrates, whose first instinct was to reject the notion that he might be the wisest of all men. In Xenophon's version, Socrates was present when the oracle made her famous pronouncement. He was said to have dwelt long and thoughtfully upon the inscription etched above the entrance to Apollo's temple, "Know thyself." This experience, Socrates said, spurred him to investigate the oracle's claim as thoroughly as he could, believing that he would eventually prove her wrong. He described approaching and conducting with many of his fellow Athenians, beginning with those generally considered to be the most knowledgeable and accomplished in the city, such as politicians and scholars. However, Socrates observed that all of those whom others believed to be the most wise, and who believed themselves to be so, were invariably unable to concludedly depend their claims to superior knowledge. He then turned to the artisans and skilled tradesmen, who were indeed wise and competent in their own particular crafts, but held little knowledge or wisdom about higher concerns, even though many of them also believed themselves to be wise. The difference between Socrates and the individuals he questioned was that he made no claims to the superiority of his wisdom. "As for me," he famously remarked, "all I know is that I know nothing." For Socrates, the no impossibility of ensuring that any knowledge constitutes an ultimate and verifiable truth should encourage intellectual humility. The part that he left unsaid was that perhaps this was precisely what the Delphi oracle meant when she said that no one is wiser than Socrates. Note that Socrates used his relentless method in interrogating his fellow Athenians' claims to wisdom. This technique often ends in what is known as aporia, an unresolvable logical dead end in an argument. As a man who openly claimed he didn't have all the answers, Socrates was not out to tell people the right ones, merely to show that through the acquisition of knowledge and the use of reason, one could expose the wrong-headed beliefs of those who thought themselves wise. His ultimate lesson was to question everything, even supposedly settled knowledge, and to be a maggot. No matter how impressive one's intellectual attainments might be, one always finds oneself once again on the frontier of knowledge. Unfortunately, but quite predictably, many of his fellow Athenians took offense at Socrates' deconstruction of the beliefs and claims to wisdom. His reduction of arguments to a state of aporia surely made him many enemies, some of whom would eventually put him on trial for his life. The reputation and fame that Socrates attained during his life in Athens are evident not only in the works of scholars but also in the works of artists. He was caricatured in the plays of Athenian playwrights, most notably by Aristophanes in his comedy The Clouds, which premiered in Athens in 423 BC. This play lampooned Socrates as a skinny, pock-mad, string-of-head aesthete with absurdly high-flown ideas about the nature and workings of the heavens and the earth. His character was depicted floating above the stage in a basket suspended by ropes and pulleys, in which the old philosopher's own flatulence appeared to propel him to anger. In some respects, we must admit that comedy hasn't changed much in more than 2,000 years. Socrates' discussion and description of Aristophanes' play in Plato's Apology suggests that Socrates might have seen the comedy himself when it was performed in Athens. Aristophanes and Socrates were at least friendly acquaintances, if not friends, if the text in Plato's Symposium is to be believed. This text, along with many others written by Plato, illustrates that Socrates had a playful, easygoing nature and a great sense of humor. Socrates may have even thought that Aristophanes' play was quite funny at the time. Sadly, the attributions made to him in such public forums, that he claimed superior knowledge of the heavens and the earth, would come back to bite him later on. Several more public marks against Socrates' reputation appeared over the next 15 years. During this period, two of his former pupils were involved in political and military developments considered both reprehensible and treasonous by many Athenians. This began with Socrates' beloved young pupil and friend, Alcibiades, elected general at just 30 years old. The handsome, dashing, and boastful Alcibiades convinced the Athenian assembly to undertake and give him command of a Sicilian campaign of 415 to 413 BT. He persuaded them to commission hundreds of ships and deploy 10,000 hoplite soldiers and 30,000 naval men. It was by far the largest and most expensive force Athens had ever assembled. The day after it was launched, political foes of Alcibiades leveled charges against him for profaning the mysteries. He was accused of vandalizing numerous shrines to the god Hermes and making light of the gods in public at a masquerade. The Athenian authorities sent troops to Sicily to arrest Alcibiades, who then escaped and defected to the side of the Spartans. Alcibiades' betrayal brought significant intelligence advantages to the Spartans and resulted in utter disaster for the Sicilian campaign, marking the biggest military loss in troops and ships in Athenian history up until that point. This was a financial disaster, which many Athenians blamed for the weakening of a military strength at a particularly crucial juncture in the Peloponnesian War. Athens was defeated in 404 BT, at which time the Spartans installed an oppressive oligarchic council to rule formerly democratic Athens. This body became known as the 30 tyrants, who ruled over Athens until 403 BC, when they were overthrown by pro-democracy Athenians, and the previous regime was restored. Prominent among the 30 tyrants was a man named Critias, another former pupil of Socrates. When he and the rest of the Spartan junta were finally removed from power, pro-democracy Athenians remembered the old association between the well-known philosopher and his authoritarian pupil. The anger against the two young men, who many viewed as arch-traitors to Athens, made Socrates seem guilty by association rather than by any action of his own. His enemies also noted that Socrates was not censured or punished by Critias or the 30 for refusing to arrest a man he knew to be innocent, Leon of Salamis, whom the oligarchs wanted to execute. This is the only instance in which Socrates was known to serve in public office. He served the one-year term from 404 to 403 BT, and it was likely only the fall of the tyrants that saved him from the rot. Still, after all the upheaval wrought by the two traitors to Athens, many continued to mutter darkly about Socrates and to wonder if his pupil's actions were the fault of Bermento. In 399 BC, 3 men of Athens, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, laid charges against Socrates for impiety and for corrupting the city's youth. They claimed that Socrates had denied the existence of the gods of Athens, invented new gods that he had claimed to understand the workings of the heavens and the earth, and that he used his talent for rhetoric to corrupt and lead young people astray. To the modern ear, few, if any, of these charges sound like prosecutable crimes. However, the justice system of classical Athens featured no official prosecutors or defense attorneys. All prosecutorial actions were initiated by private citizens. The accusers and accused were each given an equal amount of time to present their case. This time limit was determined by a water clock, which was stopped temporarily whenever a witness was called. Cases were heard by the laws or Buddhas of Athens, and verdicts were decided by a jury of 500 Athenians selected by lot. The rationale behind impaneling such loud bearers was to make bribery nearly impossible. Socrates used his allotted time and verbal skills to defend himself as thoroughly as possible. His defense forms the full text of Plato's Apology, an ironic title given that there is nothing apologetic about it. Socrates took his time addressing and deconstructing each charge, demonstrating that none were based in fact. He pointed out that, in the past, he had inadvertently made enemies of his accusers by showing their pretensions of wisdom to be false. He sensed that his accusers now leveled charges against him, which were based on unfounded rumors, suppositions, and public propaganda that had been spread about him over the years. Despite his efforts, the jury found Socrates guilty, nonetheless, by a slim margin of just 30 votes. When his time came to be sentenced, his accusers demanded the death penalty. Athenian justice provided that a defendant found guilty could propose their own punishment, which a jury might accept, showing remorse and an attempt at restitution. It was also a chance for the jury to use the judgment on whether the harsher punishment, often demanded by accusers, was merited. Socrates seems to have shot himself in the foot, so to speak, at this stage of the trial. But his reasoning was clear. Since he said he was not guilty of the crimes he was accused of, to volunteer himself to be punished would be to concede that he had done something wrong, which he had not. He had dedicated his life to the cultivation and improvement of his beloved deity, giving freely of his knowledge and instruction to anyone who taught it, for which he never charged any fees. His shabby clothes, repeat, and temperate habits could clearly testify to his poverty, as he described it, which he gladly endured since he viewed all ambitions for wealth and glory as leading to unhappiness and corruption. In fact, Socrates asserted that, instead of being punished, he ought to be rewarded. He requested that the deity of Athens offer him free meals for life, just as public benefactors and victorious Olympians received. This suggestion may well have been a joke, but it likely didn't go over well. Socrates concluded with an offer to pay a fine of 100 drachmas, which amounted to about a fifth of his estate. If this were unacceptable, he said, for friends of his who were present at the trial, Plato himself, Crito, his son Critobulus, and Apollodorus, were prepared to pay a fine of 3,000 drachmas on his behalf. The jury sentenced Socrates to death, strangely by a louder margin than the verdict that convicted him. When asked if he had anything to say, Socrates spoke directly to the jury. To those who had seen the justice in his defense, he offered thanks and praise for their civic and judicial integrity. To those who had condemned him, he stated that they had ultimately condemned themselves in the eyes of history, and he prophesied that men would always speak of actions as deliberately dishonorable. Still, as a loyal Athenian committed to the rule of law, he accepted the verdict and his sentence. Socrates spent about a month in jail prior to his execution, which was a rare occurrence indeed, since sentences were normally carried out within a day or two. However, the day before Socrates' trial, the annual religious pilgrimage to the island of Delos began. The pilgrimage commemorated Theseus' defeat of the Minotaur. According to tradition, until the ship returned to Athens, no criminals could be executed in the city. Socrates therefore had to wait several weeks for his sentence to be carried out. This was a luxury that few condemned people in the ancient world endured. Socrates spent the time putting his affairs in order, spending time with his family, and receiving visits from his friends. He was well cared for. Socrates was well cared for by his jailer, who evidently liked him and dreaded having to administer the execution. Plato's Crito and Phaedo document the last few days of Socrates' life. His friends, most notably his friend Crito, reared him to escape from prison, arguing that he had been unjustly condemned. Crito and others, or even the jailer himself, offered to help him escape, but Socrates refused. He had lived in Athens all his life, he said, and it had given him a life he believed enough to remain there and raise his children. By doing so, he had tacitly agreed to accept the laws and judgments of Athenian institutions. Despite the fact that justice had failed him, this was no reason to become a lawbreaker himself, which would cause him to forfeit all of his integrity and endanger his soul. Called Socrates, two wrongs did not make a right. On his last day, Socrates spent some private time with his sons and his wife, Xanthip. He sent them away as the day wore on, hoping to spare them from having to witness his execution, which was to take place at sunset. He spent his remaining hours on conversing with his friends about the nature of life and death, his beliefs about the immortality of the soul, and his conviction that death was not the end. He comforted his friends when some of them began to cry. As sunset approached, he asked, "Who can say for sure whether death is not better than life?" When his jailer arrived with a draught of hemlock, Socrates bid them all farewell before drinking the poison and laying down on his bed to await the end. His last words were directed to his friend Crito, "I owe a cock to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt." Scholars have endlessly debated the meaning of these words. Asclepius was a deified cult hero, worshipped by those who believed he could prevent or cure illness. Did Socrates have an actual debt to pay to a deity he believed had previously interceded for him? Did he perhaps see life as the illness of which he was buoyant and ask Crito to make a sacrifice of thanksgiving for him? The debate continues, as do many others regarding the life of Socrates. The numerous questions still surrounding him. Socrates has achieved a level of lasting fame and immortality that can only be compared to religious figures in history, such as the Buddha, Jesus, or Laozi. All four were teachers who placed marked emphasis on self-knowledge and the cultivation of the soul for moral improvement. However, alone among them, Socrates was never deified. This is not to say that Socrates had no influence on religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. His ideas on the nature and immortality of the soul, as well as his views on ethics, had incalculable influence on the early fathers of the Christian Church. The Socratic canon remains a mainstay in the libraries of Christian theology scholars today. Furthermore, his impact on education, law, and politics is still strikingly evident. Socratic teaching methods are standard in Western classrooms at all levels of education. Political and legal scholars continue to debate exactly where Socrates stood on issues like democracy versus oligarchy or social contract theory versus civil disobedience. Of course, not every subsequent philosopher or writer liked or agreed with Socrates' ideas. Most notably, Friedrich Nietzsche famously criticized the beliefs of Socrates in his 19th century works Twilight of the Idols and The Antichrist. Socrates' greatest gift to others is considered by many to be his championing of empiricism and reason. Despite his rejection of natural philosophy, Socrates never reached any conclusion, or even goes concerning metaphysical phenomena such as the soul, without employing a reasoned and logical approach that was always open to question and criticism. His epistemological framework for establishing what is true based on what is readily observable would eventually be developed by Aristotle into the first incarnation of the scientific method. Finally, Socrates' doctrine of superior authority helped establish for the first time the concept of a higher authority, beyond the political or legal, which only offers the threat of force to compel compliance. For Socrates, the higher authority could be divine, his own moral conscience, or perhaps reason itself. There is reason to believe that he viewed these entities as intimately connected. But he refused to escape from an unjust imprisonment and execution, and while his enemies got the revenge, Socrates was ultimately triumphant. Plato, Xenophon, and other writers immortalized him as a martyr to reason and integrity. The ongoing search for the historical Socrates continues. While some might call the quest futile, considering the paucity of sources available and the doubts surrounding their potential authenticity, many historians take the cue from Socrates himself. Even if one of his dialectics ended in an irresolvable aporia, with the sense that the answer might never be known or settled, that was no justification to this questioning. Though a clear picture of the historical Socrates has largely remained stubbornly out of reach, scholars will likely continue to pursue this most diluted figure, who paradoxically looms larger than almost anyone in the history of Western civilization. What do you think of Socrates? Does he deserve the title father of Western philosophy? Please let us know in the comments section. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for watching People Profiles documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no ads, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much more, please visit our community. Bye-bye, see you soon. Like it, comment to let me know what you thought of this video and subscribe to the channel.